Okay, so let me start like a little bit with kind of giving you a heads up to what I'm going to do today. Today, I'm not going to talk any more theory. We're going to revise a little bit what we learned last time. And we're going to go and really see, you know, and how that reflects in practice. And, you know, this is a first time I'm actually doing, you know, this level of grain analysis on Zoom. So definitely, like, I would love to hear a little bit your feedback afterwards. All right, let's go. I'm just gonna go start sharing the screen now. All right, so let me start. So this is a kind of an image that I like to use for my testing purposes. This is it's a little bit more accurate for kind of analysis of grain than just a plain kind of grayscale image, right? You know, kind of black to white. You know, here we have a more gradation, right? And as you can see, really this image goes all the way from kind of white, not maybe 100% super white, but that's okay. We're not really interested in what's happening when we're clipping. And then here we have a completely like, you know, zero black. And I like this image, like a kind of, it really gives me a little bit more idea to what's happening. And what I noticed is that when I zoom in at around 400%, right, that I kind of start getting a little bit of better idea to what's happening with an image. Okay, so basically, I will be trying to kind of, you know, zoom in a little bit more and help you explain a little bit to what's happening. Okay, so first I'm just gonna start by explaining a little bit, you know, like these three. I'm gonna use the three methods. One method is gonna be overlay. Another method is going to be the built-in grain by DaVinci, and then the third method is going to be Grainlab. So we're going to be able then to see, you know, how and these things are going to be working. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start. So what I do here is I go from inverse Rec 709 because this test image that I'm using is a 709 image effectively, right? And I'm going to JPlog2, okay? And then here I have just loaded like an overlay image. I think you can see it if I go here. You can. All right. So this is just a kind of, you know, a grain texture, nothing special, you know, like so. And you probably heard last week my opinion about overlaying grain textures. And then what I do is I blend them. And the reason why I blend them in log is because, and especially in JPlog2, is because JPlog2 has a very interesting characteristic, which is that it's, you know, almost pure log. Almost. There's this kind of only that little part in linear. So if you remember, like on JPlog, when we look at the characteristic curve, you know, it's just really almost linear, complete all the way with a pure log. And that's really good for the math when we are like blending or we're doing any calculations that need stop exposure accuracy. This is super important. And then what I do here is then I go from JPlog2 to 709. And I'm using ACES transforms for that I have pimped up with IDTs of ODTs for JPlog2. This is a free thing that you guys can do yourself as well. I totally encourage you to work like this. So then what I did here is I've just basically taken the grain texture. You know, this scan, I just had to adjust a little bit the mid-gray to be a little bit more neutral. And then here in my kind of key output, I'm blending it. And this is pretty much all you can do. When you get a texture like this, all you can do is just a little bit like a kind of increase its blend or decrease its blend. Okay. Now I want to just want you to pay attention to a couple of details that we discussed. Okay, so there's just a couple of details that we discussed about it. First of all, there is no color content, right? It's black. It's completely black and white. So our scopes are not showing things. There is definitely like a grain texture is definitely visible. And if you also zoom in a little bit kind of into the texture, you'll see that actually we have a great variety in a pattern. Like, so if you see like, this pattern is like is like changing, right? It's changing from one to another. But if you now go and look at a little bit like in a shadow, you'll see, oh, well, it's the same pattern, which is obvious, right? Because somebody just shot a mid-gray that creates, same type of overlay, right? So you kind of really, and if you look at it, like, let's kind of just be really honest, like, guys, if we look at it, it does feel like someone just overlaid a texture on top of it, because you see like all these parts of, shadows and highlights, and, there's hardly anything visible here. They all kind of feel they have a same texture on it. The texture is kind of, just, and that is really something that has two major problems. Main problem is grain is too visible. It's too in your face. And then you reduce it, and then it's kind of too little, right? So somebody asked me like before the class, I got an email from somebody, I forgot now, and they said, hey, Dado, can you show us how to control grain in certain parts of an image? Well, when you actually emulate grain correctly, you don't need to worry about controlling it in certain parts of the image. This is generally a problem from us using this overlay method when we're overlaying things that are not really reactive to the image content that are just kind of sitting on top. So as you can tell, like, yeah, it's, but does it look like grain? Yes, I have used these types of grain overlays a lot in my life, and I was super excited thinking this is the grain, right? Until I didn't learn better. That's usually like that. Okay, so that's kind of a starting point. I just want us to kind of understand and see, like, visually, reflect to what's happening. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to move on now into the Resolve grain. Okay, now the Resolve grain doesn't really specify any color space that it operates into. And from my testing, I found that it works really good in display gamma. Probably because the math you kind of for blending and stuff like this is based on a display map kind of encoding. That's generally the case when you don't see color managed in Resolve. Under the hub, Resolve loves its gamma. I think it's about 2.6 or something. I'm not sure exactly what they use. In any case, what it is like it has a presets like that you can choose. And I'm just going to choose basically one little stronger one so that we can kind of just start, let's say, with a tungsten one, and I'm going to just increase it. Okay, so now let's go and have a look at it like a little bit, just and try to pay attention to it. One thing you're going to notice is that there is a huge amount of repetitiveness. There is zero variation in grain pattern. I mean, like, like this to me looks all the same. Like, look, if I now go and show you the film, like, look how in film we have a variation. Some particles are bigger, some smaller, some this, because, it's film, right? There is some randomness in it. Where if you look at this, it kind of feels very mathematical, right? So it is a little bit better, I must say, like when it comes to kind of, its response, what happens in the shadows, you see, and in the highlight. It has like a little bit more of a variation there, right? And I kind of like that it kind of goes all the way to the highlight. Look, when I go in the highlight, I can see there is still grain there. And when I look and I show you this on film, right? So you see there is actually kind of quite a lot to desire in terms of the, kind of that variation in the grain and a little bit more organic kind of feel. Like it doesn't feel very organic. It feels like a pattern. Someone just kind of, has probably used like even pattern that. Now look, that has an advantage. And the advantage is that this film grain, it takes very few processing cycles and it's real time. Okay, so it's really optimized to run on a very low powered machines as well. So if you are stuck, like without any, like a machine that has a little bit stronger GPU and you haven't got access to plugin, well, like you can still use, Grain. We'll see like some other limitations of this approach, what they do. I understand. I think this Grain was mainly built from a kind of real-time performance point. Maybe that's just my thinking, or maybe that was the idea what they were doing. I'm not sure. Okay, now let's see what we can do with this grain, how we can tweak this texture, what we can do with it. Okay, so here we have some parameters, right? So first parameter is like, oh, we can kind of, this looks to me like a randomness of some sort of nature, because you see when I go really crazy with it, I start seeing the actual pattern. And I can definitely tell you this is not Boolean, because the Boolean that would continue resolving into like any resolution that you want. Because you see, when we are on one, we started seeing the actual source of the pattern. Okay, so that's a kind of one thing. Okay, so yeah. Then they have something called grain size that to me has a very similar effect, like texture. But actually what it is, it's zooming into the texture. So this is nothing else but, think about it, what DaVinci does has a texture, and now they, with a grain size, they allow you to zoom in into that texture. So you see, I'm basically like scaling the texture that's already, I must say, relatively low resolution. So kind of changing this grain size can have a really detrimental effect. Okay, then they have something called aspect ratio, probably like if you're on analog, then, sorry, of anamorphic, be careful with this, right? And then they have this thing, grain strength. Now, grain strength is effectively contrast applied to the grain, because you see, like when I'm changing it, right, you look at my scopes, what's happening is I'm basically increasing the contrast of the grain and decreasing. So think about it, we take a texture, and to that texture we apply contrast. We could do the same with a film texture. We could just, apply another node and do a little, contrast on it. And that kind of well, I don't know whether this is strength. I would rather call it a contrast, because you see when I'm on 0, there is no grain. That means there's no contrast. So yeah, that's probably how I would call it. And offset is there, which is basically just going to allow you to, like change, literally offset, because it's balanced of mid-gray, and the mathematic of overlay is working from 0.5 value. Which is why I also get most accurate result when I'm working into 6 gamma in display gamma, is because this offset definitely, operates as literally just an offset. So that's accurate description to what it really does. Now, the symmetry is gain. Like, why they call it symmetry? Well, so if you gain your texture, that means you're gonna have different blend between in the overlay mode. So kind of you can kind of, I wouldn't call it symmetry, I would probably call it gaining it. Like literally this is just like amplifying the texture that is used. Softness is nothing else but a little bit of blur that you can apply to the texture. It has a terrible, it has far too much movement, right? You never need this much, So if you ever, you're gonna need to use it, you'll see, because you see, like, for example, when I now compare it to the film texture, to the film grain, right? Then you feel like, oh, I need to add a little bit softness to kind of make it look more like film. So by default, I don't think they put a lot of softness, but that would definitely work. But in millimeters, I would use this kind of, softness. Just don't overdo it. Don't overdo it. Okay. And then they have this thing called saturation. Now, look, if I increase saturation, I really start adding color content to it, which is great, so we can actually add a little bit color. I don't know, I find grain to be much more livelier the moment we kind of put a little bit color into it, not a lot. So like you see, like a little bit softness, a little saturation goes a long way. Okay, then they allow you then to take one more time all of this texture you build, and then you can then basically do scale, like decide, oh, how much red color I want. But this is like literally applying like a offset to it. So yeah, you can kind of, but I instead of like I would say this is really wrong idea. The the these controls should control saturation, not the color grain neutral kind of balance, which is what's happening. This is almost like me kind of balancing the white point of my grain. I don't know. Like I don't know what they thought with this, because this is like just really going to ruin it for you. So don't do it. You have much better, if you want to balance out your image, there's much better ways how to do it than to do it on these controls. And here they give you an option to kind of blend how much shadow you want, right? And again, this works much better in display space than in a log space. In log space, you'll find that shadow has zero effect. So, you know, these controls definitely operate much more accurately when you're working in a display space, this kind of shadow, mid-tone, highlight. And I think this is really nice because, for example, you see, I kind of find that there is a lot of posterization here now. And I could then just go and say, well, you know, just reduce a little bit that shadow detail there, right? And then it kind of helps me like maybe clean this parts up or something like that. Okay, so yeah, so it's a definitely step up in comparison to overlaying a film, but also has like a trade-offs. You know, a trade-off is that the texture is very digital, like, you know, has got zero variations. There's very small changes in sizes. The blending is a little bit better. We have more control maybe with softness and contrast of the grain, where we can kind of tweak it a little bit to our liking, for sure. A plus is really fast. It's really real time, so that's really great. And but also has some controls that can completely, like, you know, stall you and make an absolute disaster out of image that you have to stay away from. And yes, and I would say always use it in a display space. This is definitely where the math of this whole blending and everything works the best. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to move into Grainlab. Okay, because all of those things that I was saying, you know, in my previous presentation, I was saying like, hey, you know, this is a problem, this is a problem. All of those things were really addressed in Grainlab. And you know, the reason why we always separate grain from like just pure color is because there is a really lot to a grain. You know, most film emulation plugins out there, they kind of treat grain as an afterthought. They will tell you, oh, you know, like, you know, you do film emulation, print emulation, and then you turn the grain on, right? And for me, you know, grain was always much more than just turn the grain on. I mean, like, so what kind of grain? How will I design grain? How will I make grain? What kind of grain do I want? And so on and so on. So it really required a separate plugin. And we'll see later when I'm showing you examples where you apply grain in terms of the processing pipeline, whether we apply it at the front or at the end of the processing, it has a huge impact on your image. Okay, and simply in the Grainlab, there are so many things that we just had to make it a separate plugin. It just couldn't work as a part of the Look Designer. Okay, so let me now just start a little bit with explanation to what really, you know, Grainlab does. You know, like, first of all, I'm just gonna go and just let me kind of, you know, just give you a quick comparison to how Grainlab looks in comparison to film, right? So this is the film overlay, and this is Grainlab. And now what I'm doing here is, because I'm really comparing, you know, apples and apples, I'm kind of using a 16 millimeter sample, and I'm not using any print right now, right? I'm only like basically working with a kind of negative grain. That's very important to understand. And I'm not oversampling, because, you know, the overlay was a scan, and, you know, so yeah, so you see, like, we definitely have a much higher resolution than that film scan. So yes, Okay, so that's number one. You can see that we can generate grain that's much finer. Also, notice like one other thing here is that we generate huge amount of color, right? So look, if I disable grain, there's no color, and that's a really like you'll see like that's an important element. That's a really really important element. Having a little saturation in it is super super important. Just to kind of explain you the pipeline. So I'm going from ACES and I'm inversing 709 to JPlog2, and then I'm processing Grainlab in JPlog2. Why? Why am I doing grain in on JPlog2? Because it has 18 stops. That's why. That's why. And they're all perfectly accurate 50 code values per stop. And because we need to calculate, like you remember like the first, presentation where I said that grain is exposure dependent. Now, if we then do all the math and all the grain calculation in a color space that allows us to extract very accurate levels of exposure, stops of exposure, and then it makes absolute sense to do so. And also remember that I told you like that strange behavior we discovered in grain, that the brighter the image gets, the higher the density is. Well, like today's digital cameras, they have a very high level of their highlight. So how are you going to create high density in an image if you don't have a color space that allows you to generate and calculate density at such a high exposure? You need a color space that is bigger than the actual camera in order for you to do that. You need more precision in your math for everything to kind of fit together. We'll see later, like some other kind of examples. I'm going to show you why all of that matters. Okay, so now let me kind of go like a little bit and explain you what you got here. So then I just have here JPlog2 on input. These presets, I ignore them for the moment. This was our attempt to kind of give you some starting points. I think we have to make them a little bit clearer to understand what these numbers stand for. So don't worry about them right now. Okay, so first thing what you do here is you have basically an option to say, hey, what kind of negative am I using? Okay, and how intense do I want this amount of negative grain to be, right? What is changing? If I now go into 35 millimeter, you see what happens is, think about it, that optical scaling that I was talking about, like, where we say, oh, we transform from 16 mil to 35, and then we transfer scale up from 35 to 65 and stuff like this. This is really what's changing. But what's really changing underneath is the math that is calculating, and it's scaling, based on the millimeters of the frame size of a 16 millimeter film frame, 35 millimeter film frame, or even 65 millimeter film frame. Because it's math, we can basically just go and say, okay, give me that. Now look at this now. So if I'm going to now go really, really fine. Look at the precision of this mathematical calculation that we can go to. Look at the size of this particle. Look, I'm on 1000% zoom in, and you can just kind of start seeing a little bit of the size of the texture. Yet if I turn it on and off, it's super visible in our scopes. Look at our scopes, how much they react, right? So this is number one. I'm going to now stick with 16 mil here because it's just going to be a little bit easier for you to see what's happening. The next thing you're going to notice is that there is a great variety, and also as I move around, the image gets regenerated. This is something because what happens is Grainlab is analyzing what's happening in an image and thinks there is a movement, and then it recalculates itself every time. So this is why when I move, right, the texture is not static. It's kind of, because that, that's how the algorithm works. For Grainlab, there is a movement, and it's basically recalculates the frame all the time. So the first thing you're going to notice is that there is a lot. I mean, let me just disable chrominance first, because I want to just do black and white, so just that you can focus a little bit more onto the particle. this is advantage of that kind of, Boolean model of realism is that it really models grain in different sizes. Now, just try to compare this now to a grain from DaVinci. You see how that it has this kind of very generic, very kind of, noise pattern visible, right? But you see here the noise pattern is not repetitive. It can't be repetitive because that's the part of the math. And you see also what's really interesting. You see how it blends. Look at it, just pay attention to the shadow detail here and look at the shadow detail here. You see how here we start seeing clogging, right? Let me just go back here because I blended it less. Let's kind of, so you see what's happening. So you see how here very quickly you start noticing a little noise. Well, we don't really want a noise, right? And you see how a Grainlab doesn't really need to generate that noise because it adapts itself to the exposure. So it's generating different type of the grain for different level of exposure. And that's a huge advantage. So you see the texture just feels much more organic. And again, let me zoom into the highlight. Look, if I now zoom completely into the highlight, look, even the brightest parts have got visible grain in them because we increasing density of the grain. And it's not that we have more grain, it's just that grain is becoming more visible because the density curve of the grain generation is changing with the brightness as well, because we kind of know, yes, of course, that's really what happens. Okay, so this is really a major difference. Let me now zoom in a little bit into the shadow, because the shadows are super important. And you see, there is no noise. There is no noise. The shadows still feel very clean. You know why? Because the grain is just has a lower contrast in the shadow. So you see the contrast curve of the grain is also changing. And that's a kind of huge advantage. That's a huge advantage that you are not failing, you're not making your image noisy. I mean, let me just show you a comparison with a film overlay, which is what we've been using and relying on. Look, if I show you, this is the film overlay. Look how noisy is the shadow. It's just a mess down there, right? Why? Because we overlaid a mid-gray, right? And now here, you see, it feels nice and clean, right? So it's not going to fail the QC. It's just going to feel really like it should. We're going to compare now, as well, all this grain with the real grain as well. I have some film shots and I'm going to show you there's a great trick how you can compare what you're having. Now, I want to show you another trick which we have built in, which is again something that is and it's a concept of oversampling. So you probably heard in a previous presentation before. And by the way, this is no other plugins are basically discussing this or trying to improve it. The problem of spatial frequency, okay? A fixed scan, fixed camera, digital cameras, they have a fixed spatial frequencies. It's the generally situation with any kind of, it's a Nyquist theory. We can't just really get away from it. But what we can do, and that's there is a kind of way how we override the Nyquist theory is by oversampling. So certainly we can't really generate an image with higher spatial frequencies than what we have sampled, what the image has. But what we can do is we can create an optical illusion that there is a higher frequency there. By the way, this is the same trick we use in audio as well. It's not just in picture. So what we do is we have this trick called oversampling. So what oversampling does is takes multiple frames and then blends them in a way that they generate perceptually higher frequency than what actually has been sampled. So look at this now. So look, if I now completely remove the grain, right, and move it on, you see how fine the texture is. I'm on 16 millimeter maximum, right? Actually, when you're on oversampling, you can also increase this master control. Master control on 0.5 is what you should always have. Anything higher than 0.5 means you're amplifying results. So it's not it's impossible for you ever to get this in real life. This is an amplification, but I'm just going to amplify for you to see. So what really happens is you get this incredibly fine negative texture. And that is something that a lot of cinematographers who shoot on Alexa 35 love, because Alexa 35 has these textures. They're so fine. They're so like, you know, like I probably don't want to spill too much the beans, but listen to that interview with Harold. He will explain it. So, you know, and we really build this for them, and we build it because we love the, you know, increased spatial frequency. We love that kind of straight away feels a little bit more analog, because look, if you look at the edge, the high contrast edge, right? So look, if I'm here on a very on this area here, okay. Now look, I'm just gonna go and say on and off, right? So look how this basically is on a very high contrast edge, how it's softening that kind of, you know, which is what we want, you know. It's like, this is really what kind of filtering really does, but we do it through oversampling. Okay, so this is, I'm going to disable oversampling now. Okay, and bring this back because it's crazy. So this should be 0.5, 0.5, and then this should be a little lower. Okay, great. So now we have that. Okay, and then again, no other plugin out there has even kind of, you know, attempted to do this or has been doing it. What most people are doing is just probably like a just negative grain. I think that's what we're seeing mainly. But we learned that the real grain that we've been seeing, it was always a combination between negative grain and print grain, and we also seen that there is no linear relationship between negative and print, that they affect one another in a nonlinear way. So this is why we have introduced a print grain step that is optional, right? So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to say enable print grain. And only now that you enable print grain, you really get the full power of Grainlab. It's not going to slow you down in any way, but what you do is you get much bigger, you know, like in a look. So you see, look at it now. So this is just a negative, and this is now with a print, right? Negative and print. And then if I'm going to add now my chroma to it, then I'm able to cut to an incredibly organic and beautiful results. This is now where we are, like, if we start comparing it with a kind of, you know, film sampling, you see, like, it's almost like, you know, we got the same texture but at higher resolution. You see, I can see compression here on these images, right? I can see like a blocks of compression, right? But we don't have that because we don't really sampling texture. We're working, you know, internally. We're generating this texture for you, right? So and these two then really, like, you know, round this image, like you see they have a little halo around, you know, they really start behaving more like film. Look at the richness of the texture. You know, this texture doesn't necessarily feel anymore like there is like a clear pattern. The blending is absolutely, looks beautiful, right? Let me just compare it now with a DaVinci. You see how in DaVinci these gradients are not necessary, like working very well, but look, when you have a fine film grain, you see how you're stepping through an incredibly beautiful, you know, path. This is another advantage of us working in an extremely high dynamic range image. And then you're getting texture, you're getting film grain, but at a very high fidelity. And that's really what we wanted. We wanted to kind of generate something that is going to work like that. Then you have some controls here. Like you can say, oh, I don't want to have too much grain in the shadow. Can we please get rid of that? Yes, you can like do that. Then we have a chroma. Now the chroma works slightly different. It's only saturation. So it's always going to be grain staying neutral, but I'm just able to decide how much of cyan, how much of magenta I want. So look at my scopes here, like a vector scope here. What happens is just kind of basically little bit kind of, you know, nudges the amount of saturation, but not really like it changes the white point of your grain. Oh yeah, and we have a flicker and gateway, but I'm not going to have time to go into this. This is another conversation. We're going to talk about it. Maybe it needs like maybe another stream as well. So I'm just going to leave completely without it. Okay. So I hope now you see the difference in amount of choice an amount of precision in calculation, an amount of, you know, like ability to shape the texture, to shape the grain, to wrap itself around your image. And you know, you probably like, you know, I mean, it doesn't take a genius, you know, to kind of go and look at this and go like and say, hey, look, this is my kind of, you know, DaVinci grain. This is my film, you know, look at it, look at the Grainlab, look at just the precision of this gradients, you know, they just feel incredibly, you know, subtle. They blend them, they blend properly in, which is what you would get from a film negative. But before I start telling you what you would get, I want to show you an interesting test that I always like to do when I'm testing any kind of, you know, grain or anything like that, and it's following. Okay, what I got here is a shot that was shot on Eterna, on Fuji Eterna 500. Okay, so this is actually shot on film and scanned. Okay, so this is film scan. Okay, negative only, hasn't been printed. Okay, so we're just gonna go and zoom in into the face, and as you can tell, yeah, it has grain, isn't it? Beautiful grain. My God, you know, film still looks the best, kind of, right? Okay, now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go now and show you this. This is a trick, you know, that I like to do. Let me just go and show you, first of all, disable all of these, and just to show you this. Okay, so what I do, right, I take this negative. I have, by the way, just applied, you know, this is linear ACES file. This shot is part of the ACES standard testing kind of images. So what I do is I go here from ACES linear to JPlog2, and then again from JPlog2 to Rec 709. And I'm not applying any Grainlab. So what I do then is I degrain the image, right? So what I do here is I remove the grain. Okay, so we look, this is what I get. So I get original image. Let me just go and make it a little larger so you guys can see better. Okay, and I like to keep the scope so that you can see what's happening, because look at the scopes, right? So look at this now. So this is the zoom in, like a really big zoom in into original negative, and this is the degrained version of that same image, right? This is with grain, this is degrained. Okay, so why we do this? Well, that's kind of, you know, a great way for us to then to see how close we are getting in comparison to real grain. Because, you know, like you have to understand that everything we're doing inside is a map. There is no film scans inside. We're not really scanning film. So the only way for us to do it is to compare. I'm going to show you like this method where you can compare it by eye, and possibly, like, you know, I'm sure we're going to do another future stream where I'm going to show you how AI can analyze those two frames and can give you an incredibly accurate comparison between what you're doing and what's happening. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to enable my grain, right? Again, I'm disabling the print because this is negative. I'm using 35 millimeter, right? And I'm basically amplifying this 35 millimeter to the max, okay? And let's see what we're getting, and look at these results. Look at these results. So this is real grain, Grainlab. Real grain, Grainlab. I'm granted I'm using oversampling, right? If I was to disable oversampling, I would be a little too strong. I would have to go a little back, you know? Real grain, Grainlab, real grain. Oh, sorry. I shouldn't have touched it. 1 second. Because when I'm moving, this is real grain, Grainlab. Let me just kind of try to adjust it a little bit by eye. Maybe bring this one down a little. Okay, that could work. Let's go. You see, so this is without oversampling. Let's go full screen again. So, right, Grainlab, real grain, Grainlab, real grain. So you see how close we are. And I know to eye this looks very close, but trust me, when you actually load it into AI and image analysis, you get an incredibly accurate picture that is not necessarily visible to the eye because you have a spatial frequency, you have, you know, like a neighboring pixel, you get lots more analysis that is just, you know, really, really an incredibly, you know, important part of, you know, fine tuning these algorithms and making them basically work really, really well. Okay, now I want to show you another test, which I also recommend you do, like every time you kind of are comparing, you know, performance of any grain emulation that you are planning to use. And especially I recommend that you use that in 4K. So let me show you what it is. So basically, one of the most challenging elements of grain emulation is, or like a kind of is what happens when we have a very fine gradients, uh, when a very fine tune, like a kind of, because you know how are we going to then, you know, like a blend in the kind of beautiful roll of unfold of like we have here in this situation with the sky. Okay, so look, so this is kind of, you know, just go and find a shot that has like a big sky like this one. Okay, and what I'm going to do first is I'm just going to go and show you now just a film grain from DaVinci. Okay, so now watch this. When I zoom into it a little bit, you're going to start noticing, I don't know whether this is visible on, I'll try to zoom in enough that you can start seeing it. Look at now how here we start seeing slight discoloration. See how I can have a little yellow purplish tones? Right, and look, when I disable film grain, they're all gone. But when I enable them, they're all there, but my saturation is on 0. Okay, it is part of the kind of optical effect. It's we probably don't, there is probably no real color content in it, but this kind of texture, because it's so repetitive, creates a moire effect, effectively, moire-ish effect. I mean, this is a really subject for any one of my students to write a thesis on this subject and research this properly. And that's a kind of what the issue with the repetitive grain texture. When you have something very repetitive, then our eyes start kind of seeing color when there is no color really visible. And this is why, like, you know, it's possible for you to look at this sky and you start seeing like a green and purple lines. They're not really there. It's just an issue with it kind of, you know, gradual with the same pattern that's applied to it, right? So now I'm going to go and apply this same thing with a Grainlab, and that pattern is gone. Well, it can't be there because we don't have a fixed pattern. We don't use a fixed pattern like, you know, film grain plugins. So you can't really start getting any more harsh effects or anything like that in here. Another thing I want, you know, like for example, you see if you look here around the highlights, very bright highlights, you know, we kind of are clipping, which is normal, right? We're filming into the sky. Look, if I now go here, you see how film grain loses. There is 0 grain detail here. The brighter something gets, because it doesn't understand the density, you know. So, but if you do this on a Grainlab, it actually rounds off your highlight, and that's exactly what we were talking about. That increased density of silver halide crystals is it contributes to the effect of film roll-off. And if you look at now this highlight, you see like a high density grain, no high density grain, just a texture. You see how highlights are very bright, they're just peaking, and here I'm able to tame them down, to roll them off. I'm not doing anything else, by the way. As you saw my node tree, I'm just applying a texture. That's all I'm doing. But you see, this is an incredibly important advantage of that kind of calculation of the grain, that increased high density helps the roll-off. And that's just for that reason. So for example, if you say, I don't want to have any grain, but I do love the roll-off, that I get with Grainlab, what you can do is you can go over sampled 65 millimeter grain. It won't be visible, but it's going to have the same effect on your highlight. It's just going to naturally roll it off a little bit and blend it like that. So this is a really like an interesting test that you should always, see and compare. If you're choosing grain, if you're sitting with client and you're trying to do a good emulation, show them as well the importance and how the texture is. So, cinematographers love this stuff. They if they hate anything, is it kind of really hard clip on their lenses? They really love this. So it's a one of these kind of byproducts that you don't necessarily think about when you start using high quality grain emulation, but actually it's there as well. Now, talking about high quality grain emulation, I want to talk to you about another aspect, another problem that we generally find it's happening with grain emulation, which is what happens when we go HD 4K, right? How do different grain emulations behave on, let's say, HD sequence and a 4K sequence? So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to, this is a 4K sequence. This is originally 4K file, right? And I'm going to take a film, the DaVinci's Film Grain, right? And I will, let me just go to my gallery and open a new still because I don't want to mix them up. Okay, great. And what I'm going to do is, look, so basically I'm in 4K. I have exactly same setting, 16 millimeter, 500T, and I'm on 100%. Just want to have a strong grain, 16 millimeter. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go and grab this as a still. Okay. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the HD version of this sequence. Okay. And I'm going to go and apply the same grain just in HD, right? So again, 500T at 1%. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to now compare these two. I'm going to play this still and I will go and say, all right, give me now this one in side by side. An interesting thing you're going to notice here. Check this out. Look at look at the difference. It's I mean it's I can tell you exactly what the difference is. It's 4 times. It's 4x. The reason why you see this grain 4 times is because I am assuming this, I haven't written the code for film grain, but just if I was to code it and I was to get this result, what would have happened? Would, this is optimized for real time and they have a limited amount of resolution available in their textures. So when they scale an image to 4K, the textures don't necessarily stretch, which is why the textures appear so much stronger and in a 4K resolution. So that's a problem, guys. That's a real problem. Because you could, for example, work and adjust your grain in HD, and then you say, oh, let me render now this in 4K. And then you're gonna wonder, why is everything so grainy? What's happening? I mean, it could be a disaster. So just be really, really careful. I'm just telling you, when you're testing whatever you're gonna do, please do this test. Do the 4K HD test. It's very important. When I'm already on that subject, let me just kind of show you now. I'm gonna go into 4K. And I will now switch to, I'm going to switch now to Grainlab. Okay, I will now grab this as a still. And then I'm going to go to my HD sequence. And then I'm going to switch to Grainlab. Again, just the same setting, right? Nothing changed. And I am going to, not the media pool, but my gallery. Okay, this is the one. I'm going to play it back. And now let me show you what happens here. Selected still images. There we go. And now you see it's exactly identical. There is no difference in two in HD or in 4K. Why? Because it resolves itself not based on a resolution of your timeline, but it just fills it up basically on the fly because it's using slightly different math for that. All right, another test I also wanted to show you, which is again a very important test for how to deploy grain, and I wouldn't really ignore that. This is a really important one, and it's the order of operation. Okay, so um, basically, there is a difference, not a massive, but there is a difference. And when you are building your pipeline, when you're building your node tray, you really want to then be able to understand um, um, where in that pipeline you want to put your grain. Okay, and unfortunately, this is not a yes or no answer. There are like ways of doing it in different way. I'm going to show you what happens, but first of all, in order for you to be able to choose where you want to do it, you need to have a plugin that is going to allow you to put grain in a scene referred space. And this is another advantage why I always loved that I had a Film Grain plugin as a separate element. Because, I don't want to be locked that on my print stage when I'm like in the output side, that's the only place where I put grain. That's not, I want to be free to choose where this grain is going to come. Okay? So the general census is that, you put it just before the ODT. You put it on the output, right? So this is what I do, as I have here an IDT, right? I have a beautiful red camera. Dan, what a wonderful camera. Now that Dan is here, I have to give Red all the praises. Dan, do I get any extra deals on that new Nikon, man? Is there something we can do about that? Actually, don't worry. It's already actually so cheap I buy it. Don't worry. I'm joking. I think this is gonna be the killer camera, man. I have to tell you, you're gonna kill even Blackmagic with that camera. Anyway, well done, Nikon. Well done. All right, so I have an IDT here with this wonderful camera called Red. And then here I have a Shola that goes JP-Log2, JP-Log2. And then here I've just applied like a little film emulation. Like I'm going Agfa negative and I'm doing Kodak MPF for print. And then here I go ODT, which is again JP-Log2 to Ceno9. And then what I'm doing is I'm applying grain after Sholat. Yeah, so at the end. Okay, which is how most kind of, these plugins that kind of give you everything all in one will want you to do. And yeah, this is how it looks. All right. So I'm using like a strong grain and I'm blending negative and print. Okay, now look, if I go next and I now move the grain to be in front of my Sholat. So this is a principle where you say, well, hang on a moment. I'm pretending that I'm shooting on film, so there's going to be grain already in my negative, right? I have to have grain already on my input. And then I'm going to do all the color afterwards, right? Which is a very valid point. Okay, now I want to show you what happens then. Like it's going to be very hard for you guys to kind of see it like in an image, but look at my vector scope. Okay, so this is pre-LUT, this is post-LUT, pre-LUT and post-LUT. A huge actually difference if you think about it. And it's obvious because the Sholat does so much with color. It changes the gamut, it changes the tonal response in certain way as well. So when you apply grain to it, right, it is going to go and look different, right? So you see, I actually get like a little more kind of subtle, nicer version of it, when it's a pre-Sholat. Now, what I think in terms of the accuracy, and it at least like from when we start measuring things with AI image analysis, and I think this is now where we go in territory where the eye doesn't necessarily, help us a lot, is this approach. This is the approach. You go already on the IDT and you apply negative only there, right? Not the print. So you go and say, well, I shoot on film, so my negative is going to have a negative grain. And then I'm printing it out, and then I'm going to only have a print grain. So the show that happens in between. So I'm not putting them together. I'm not putting all the grain in one node. I'm actually doing negative grain, print grain, and in between I do all of my grading, right? That is effectively the most accurate way of how you would try to do it, but has a disadvantage that you're going to run 2 grain plugins. And yeah, I mean, you need a lot of process. You need a good computer for that. So basically, you see, so this is my pre-LUT. This is post, post and pre. This is two grain nodes, right? So this is so yeah. So I personally kind of think like, yeah, if we are to be like a nitpicky, and I think that this should be the most accurate way of doing things. But again, sometimes you can't choose, you might not have, enough GPU cycles to do both, right? So in any case, what we can conclude is that there is a difference in the result we will be getting depending to where in the processing pipeline we will be applying the grain emulation for sure. And, you need to decide where you want to do this. I find that some cameras that have a natural texture, I like to then just put the grain at the end, and some cameras that look super clean, I really need that texture in the input already, because I kind of feel like that, then my skin and everything just, starts reacting to the texture, and I just feel that a lot of decisions I'm doing then later with skin tones and qualifiers and everything get affected with the texture that is blended in the image while it's on the IDT stage. So yeah, so that would be kind of my all I had in terms of the order. Yeah, I didn't forget anything. This is all I had for you guys for this, but I want to open to you. I'm pretty sure you guys have some questions and suggestions or anything, so please let me know what's up. I'll open the chat.
There was a question. What
Mm,
what did you use for denoising the first clip?
it's my secret weapon. I'll show you. I'm joking. Okay, so we go to, no, what was it? HD test. Then I go here, and then I go degrain, and then I go here, which is the motion effects, and I call the AI Ultra. And then I sample skin. My computer's getting ready. See, I'm sampling skin. And that gives me the best denoising result, because I'm focusing also on the skin when I'm analyzing grain. For me, I don't know what comes first. Like, some people say, oh, it's got a great skin tone, but right, I have to tell you something, guys. Skin tones is skin texture. It's not color. It's not color. It's really skin texture. And then I think you're guys on the right path by wanting to put a little texture inside. Yeah, I think you are, because that's one thing that like, it's gonna really improve Red's skin. It's not the color. And so when I'm building grain, analyzing grain, I really love to look at the skin. For me, That's really, and this is why I also like this kind of spheres, because the magic of that kind of, like a filtration that you get from beautiful high density grain, and how it treats the highlights. It's just incredible. And, shaves of hours and hours of work later of me having to retouch, put some mid-tone detail, which is very rough, if you think about it. So yeah, so that's how I denoise. That's the answer to the question. What else?
Okay, so MTO was wondering, what are your thoughts on how the Grainlab plugin works in comparison to the more organic grain inside FilmLook Creator?
Look, the film note creator, guys, has got the same idea of film grain, but it does, it adds a little bit more processing to it. There is no like a difference in there. DaVinci that can't afford really to build a high-end film emulation plugin because it won't play on every machine. You have to understand, every plugin that DaVinci builds themselves has a minimum processing kind of system, which DaVinci tells you, hey, you need this computer in order, right? And if they kind of come up with a really sophisticated film emulation plugin and they put it onto that minimum machine, it's not playing, it doesn't go into DaVinci. It doesn't get inside. Okay? And we all know, like, it's a physics, right? You need a lot of processing cycles to do much more sophisticated image processing, like when you're trying to create something like that. Okay? So I haven't had a chance to open that film creator like and analyze it in depth, but you can do it MTO yourself and just see. I am certain that they use the same method that they use in film grain, where they have a very clean and repetitive texture that they are scaling and modifying.
It works similar to yours. Yours is better. I just can't put my finger on why, but it does have it does sort of respond to the image and has a more organic, like it kind of does similar to what yours does, or it's trying to.
But
That's why I
in
was curious why yours though. Yours is better. I just can't put my finger on why.
Yeah, but the problem about mine is expensive, like when you put it on a 4K timeline and you notice it, the system just like feels a little bit like, ooh, ooh, I need to now push this grain, right? It kind of,
Yeah.
and that's what annoys me. Like personally, I kind of, I go like, okay, I have to work now in HD just because I'm using this plugin, like, and I would love, Mark, if I could have it run faster, and I will at one moment. Hopefully, I will.
Right. Thank you.
But this is it. Now, look, I am pretty certain that there are certain things in the film look creator that are not necessarily just film grain related, but maybe a little bit filtering and a little bit other things that they do that kind of helps with that look. Because we learned like it's not. Maybe that's going to be our next conversation where we're going to be talking about spatial frequencies, and all these things, glows and halations and everything else that really comes to that film look. So in any case, I look, for your workflow. I understand when you have to hand off your project to somebody
Yeah.
and they just open DaVinci and the plugins there is fucking awesome, right? And when you tell them, oh, I've been using custom grain plugin,
Yeah.
it's a fire let loose, right?
Yeah. When it's my own projects that I'm handling, then I can totally use yours.
Yeah.
It's just when I have to hand it over to another company, it
Yeah.
makes it easier.
Yeah, but you know what, Mark? We're just running an annual sale on a plugin, because a lot of people who downloaded Look Designer in the past says, "Oh, we want a grain as well." So there is the same deal now on Grainlab. It costs only $200 perpetual, or $100 annual. So if your clients are like if you ever have a client that you work with, just tell them go and buy it now, because if you get the perpetual and then you sort it. So it shouldn't be too, it shouldn't break anybody's bank. I really think this is kind of, if you, or you can tell them, how about we can work with the, what's it called, that real grain, right?
Oh my. I haven't heard. Yeah, I haven't heard about those people in a long time.
Yeah, I'm wondering. No. I think there are still productions
still doing it?
using. I think there are still people doing them. Yeah,
Oh,
I don't know how much, right? But I'm pretty sure there is still, like some cinematographers
Well,
that can pay that, right?
my last show that I did like that on was a Netflix show called Brand New Cherry Flavor, and it was a hassle. It was a hassle to
Really?
deal with. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Haven't worked with it since. But all right, thanks.
Yeah,
for
yeah.
the
I
answer.
wonder what's happening with that, but we'll see. We'll see. We'll see. Yeah. No, I think he had his ride maybe 10 years ago. You know, that was very interesting what he was doing. Okay. Any other questions, Luis? Or should I just have a look a little bit? What about power windows? Where they better be? That's a good question. So, Ricardo, in as long as I personally would stay away from idea that you're controlling your grain through a power window. Okay, I I don't know if this is like I'm sure some people might even do it, go like, oh, I don't want too much grain in the sky, so I'll do a power window and block it from there. Like, do not do that. Do not do that. You know, work with your grain texture to blend it in such a way so that you never affect grain with any power window, you know, because you're really like going into territory where you're going to start, it will break at one moment, it will become visible. And once it's become visible, the whole magic of texture is gone, right? So I would really do that. In general, what I do is, you know, like for example, I put power windows very early on before my primary if I'm dealing with shots that haven't had chance to be lit properly. Okay, so let's say I'm working now on some reality TV show and there is no lighting. There's somebody running around with a camera, right? So what happens is there is no like a proper foreground background separation in a way how they lit the show. So what I do is I put the power windows at the front, already kind of on the IDT stage before I do any primary or show LUT, and I do little separation. And then my LUT looks much better because my LUT expects kind of, you know, a tonality between shadow, and then suddenly the LUT kind of feels a little better. But if I'm working with people who are shooting, you know, who just know what they're doing, they're controlling light, then I put little windows at the post show LUT because I'm just kind of a little bit helping to what they are doing and how they're lit, and maybe I'm just, you know, adding a little bit more depth to an image. But I don't really need to fix anything at the front. So if you know what I mean. So yeah, so again, like, you know, horses for courses, yeah, right? You have to see like what show I'm working on and how it's going to work. Placing neat and GL pre-clip allows one to cache them. That's true, actually. That's a very good idea. That's a very good idea. How you will include LensLab into the node tree? LensLab comes all the way at the front. Yeah, LensLab comes very early on, like again, like, you know, even before the grain, before anything else. That's going to happen. Christian says, when it comes to playback performance with Grainlab, would it make sense to use an older grain method like DaVinci default one during grading for smoother previews? No, you just work in HD. Like if you really have a problem, just put your timeline into HD, and don't worry, when you scale to 4K, it's all gonna work absolutely fine. So you know, like as I showed you, like a 4K or HD sequences work really well with Grainlab, and when it's HD, it works really well. You know, it's only the size when it needs to generate 4 times the size of the texture where it gets a little bit tricky. So yeah, so that's what I would do. Bartosz, you had a question. Go ahead.
Yeah, hi, Dado. I have actually a general question.
Uh-huh.
I mean, all electronic devices produce noise.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of in the process of film scanning at all, in general, how important is this role? I mean, the digital or electronic noise affects actually the image at the end.
100%.
And
100%.
how you manage it, and you in your you know, in your research,
So you have to just think about it like this, Bartosz. We started scanning film many years ago when electronic devices and sensors were nowhere as near as good as they are now.
Sure.
So we had that problem from like many years ago. And you know, if Josh is in the audience, he's probably gonna tell you better than I do. But basically, what you do is you lift your black. That's why the log signal starts at 90. Because you move away from the noise. You know, so you basically you're not taking blacks as black, you're amplifying the black to be at 90 100, right? And then you're then move from that area of the sensor that has a lot of noise.
What do you mean by 90 and 100?
So on a 10-bit
Red
scale, so
Yeah.
like a 10-bit scale, it goes from 0 to 1024.
Yeah.
And when you take like a film scan, the film scan blacks are sitting on 90.
I see. Okay.
So and there is a process, like when you start scanning, you go and say, hey, this is my white, this is my black. And when you do that, you basically tell your scanner, you know, in what range to scan. So you find like usually maybe off main frame, you find like a black, you go and find some white, you know, and that's how you set the points of that for that particular negative that you're scanning. And that gets this pure black and pure white then get mapped to 90 to 895, I think. And that way you are basically not including the sensor noise in your film scans.
Yeah, I was just going to say, Dado, that's sort of kind of true. But yeah, it is lifted off the noise floor of the sensor, but setting white and black is back from the old days of telecine.
Uh-huh.
Now with film scans, it's like you really want to know that your digital numbers in your file correspond to absolute densities on the film. You know, you don't want from scene to scene your contrast to change wildly or stuff. So the film scans are all at pretty fixed contrast and gamma. But yeah, it is lifted off of that. The other thing, of course, that's interesting is if you're scanning negative, what you're calling highlights, what we all call highlights, are actually the densest part of the negative. So those wind up being, you know, it's sort of interesting, the noisier, you know, parts of the scan.
Of course, because they are inverted. Yes, yes, yes.
But anyway, sorry, didn't mean to.
No. Thank you. I'm glad. Josh, anything you want to add more, please? Do you have, do you want to slap me on my fingers or whatever? What did I say anything bad?
Last week was my opportunity to nitpick. This was more of a demo, and
Uh-huh.
it was very good. So no, I have a feature request. Not that I use this, but you know, every time you move the image around when you zoomed in, the grain changes, you know, in your plugin, and I completely understand that.
Uh-huh.
I think there would be times when it would be nice to lock that off, like when you're zooming in and look, you know, moving around, you know, rather than be distracted by this ever-changing grain pattern when I'm just, you know, zooming in and repoing, if there's a way of disabling that. Then of course you turn back on.
It's called freeze. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I agree with you. Actually, you know, I had those guys who work in visual effects on Nuke, you know, they asked me, how can I freeze the grain? I was like,
Damn visual effects folks. Yeah.
I know. I said, God, it was a problem enough just to make it run on your fucking Nuke, you know, now I have to even freeze it. But yeah, I agree. I agree. When you start zooming around, it becomes a little distraction. Yeah. And you know, Josh, by the way, guys, has a great name for plugin. Josh, do you wanna tell them how you're calling what's your idea how we should call the grain plugin?
I'm trying to remember. Oh, migraine.
When we were building this one, just said we can do it only under one condition, that it's called migraine. I love the name.
I'm surprised you haven't trademarked that yet.
I'm gonna do it straight after the call.
Well, someone else here is gonna beat you to it, right?
What a great day, man. I could see already like a packaging of like for pain pills, like says migraine on it. That's kind of the logo for the grain. Oh, thank you, Josh. Thank you for chipping in. I love it. Will there be a perpetual option for LensLab? Yes, there will be. We know we're working on a new release, by the way, for that. And as soon as this is ready, we'll have like some special deals. Santiago says, interesting. The choice FilmLab in the Notary has produces very nice results. IDT lens, negative grain, CDL look, secondaries, halation, parallel to grain. And I love it. Yes. Yes, Rodrigo, that's a great one. Okay, guys, I hope you liked it. I hope you liked it. Come on, give me a thumbs up if you think this was useful. Yeah, thank you. Wow. Lots of love. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. We're going to continue the film journey. We're going to continue film emulation journey. And next week, we're going to continue on this subject. I hope to be able to deliver to you next week the spatial frequency story, because it's a very important part of that. Enjoy, everybody. Have a great weekend. It's a holiday for some. It's Yom Kippur as well. So have a great time, and I'm gonna see you same time, same place, Friday again. Take care, everybody. See you soon. Take care. Thank you, Louis. Thank you. Bye and bye-bye.